Next is the 3-act structure. And when you think of 3-act structure, it is exactly what it sounds like. There's a beginning, middle, and then an end, right? Those are the 3 structures. But within those 3 structures, there are some points, some definitive points of this formula that you're going to want to hit. And so act 1, right? This would be the beginning of your story. Okay, so first you're going to establish the world that the character is living in. What's happening? What is life like? What's the ordinary world, right? You're setting the scene for the reader. So the first few pages of your comic book, you're doing world building. Who is this character? Who's their family? You know, what are they like, right? Where do they live? Those sorts of world building elements and settings that you're going to introduce the reader to, that are important to the reader understanding the story, right? Second thing in the first act is an inciting incident, right? So an event that sets the story in motion. What happens that sets the story in motion? You know, is it a ordinary kid that's, you know, ordinary teenager that's living his or her life, going to school, dealing with bullies, those sort of normal everyday issues that we might be dealing with, and then a meteor hits the earth, and now this ordinary kid is affected by a meteor and now has superpowers. You know, these are just examples. So what is the event, right, in this first act that's going to set the story in motion? Think, you know, of Spider-Man, right? The kid gets bit by a spider, right? That's a major event that sort of sets the story in motion. Next part of act 1 is plot point 1. Okay, so the protagonist decides to tackle the challenge head on. So this could be, if we're sticking with the example of, you know, a teenager doing ordinary things, a meteor hits the earth, the teenager gets superhero powers because of this meteor, and you know, maybe the teenager realizes that he now has these superhero powers and he wants to go try to save the world, and he's looking in the mirror like, I'm going to do this, I'm a superhero now, it's my duty to do this, right? So plot point 1 is that first part of the first act where the protagonist says, I'm going to do this, I'm going to tackle this head on. Second act is going to be the middle of the story. Okay, so there has to be some confrontation, there has to be some conflict, right? The superhero can't just, you know, get superhero powers and they don't have a villain, right? They don't have anything they're fighting for or against, right? There has to be some sort of confrontation that the reader can identify and connect with. So there needs to be some rising action, right? The story's true stakes become clear. You know, what is this superhero fighting for, right? And what's important? What are the values that are important to this superhero that they're fighting for? And when we're talking about writing comic books, you know, I know well that you don't have to have a comic book story with a superhero, like a true superhero that has on a costume. It could be a regular, you know, person that's just the figurative superhero of their story. So when I say superhero, you know, I'm just using that as an example. I don't want to stifle your creativity and have you think that, you know, the comic book genre only has to fit into one archetype or types of stories. You know, I promote comics and comic books for people, and I see all types of awesome, amazing stories because they're breaking outside of the traditional mold of, you know, there's a superhero, there's a villain, you know, and that kind of thing. So the rising action, you know, the story's true stakes become clear. We see exactly what is at stake. You know, if the superhero doesn't do X, you know, maybe they're going to lose their family, maybe the world's going to blow up, right? Whatever the stakes are. Midpoint in act 2 is an event that upends the protagonist's mission, right? So we're traveling on this story with the superhero. We feel like the superhero has these superpowers. He's going to save the world or tackle successfully whatever the conflict or problem it is that you introduce. But now something unexpected happens, right? Maybe they temporarily lose their superhero powers, or maybe, you know, one of their parents dies. Whatever it is, right? It has to be something, and try to make it a surprise to the audience because you know, Audiences typically like suspense, right? You don't want your story to be too predictable. So story arcs, right? The story arcs that we're teaching you, they are a formula, but that doesn't mean that you can't add surprises in there, right? And keep the reader on his or her toes and add cliffhangers, right? Cliffhangers are mechanisms that you use to keep the story going and to keep readers turning the page. They're turning the page because they want to know what happens next, right? So plot point 2 of the second act is the protagonist is tested in some way and fails, right? Think about the Black Panther movie, okay? T'Challa loses the fight the first time against Killmonger, right? So the protagonist is tested, and in Black Panther, T'Challa is thrown over the cliff. We think that he dies. We think that he failed. Okay, so that's a good example of an act 2 plot point 2, right? That would be recognizable as an example, right? So we did act 1 the beginning, we did act 2 the middle, okay, and act 3 would be the conclusion, right? You're wrapping things up. So what happens towards the end of the story? What happens in the conclusion? Well, there's resolution, right? We get closure. So part 1 of act 3 is the protagonist, must make a decision. Okay, there has to be some decision that has consequences, right? At this point, as the reader or the viewer, we be rooting for the superhero. Yeah, go do it. That sort of thing. Part 2 of act 3 is the protagonist is tested one last time, usually by the villain or the antagonist, right? And we're wondering, will the hero prevail this time? Again, think about the movie Black Panther, right? So T'Challa comes back to life, and then he decides that he's going to go and fight Killmonger again. But we have to wonder, is he going to win this time around, right? Can he do it, right? Can he get the Wakandans to support him again? That kind of thing, right? And then the conclusion. The conclusion is you want to tie up the loose ends for your reader, right? And so at the end, the reader or the viewer is going to discover the consequences of, the climax, the consequences of the story and the decisions that the hero has made throughout, or the main character has made throughout his or her journey. Now, if you're doing a comic book series, and maybe you have 9 issues in season 1, and that there's going to be a season 2 or a season 3, you're going to tie up all the main loose ends, but you're going to leave some things loose so that you can then continue on in the second season, right, to continue to further develop, right, the story. Okay, so you always want to leave the reader satisfied, but if you want to continue the story into multiple seasons, right, leave some cliffhangers in there so that the reader will want to come back and read your second season. Now, if you're just doing a comic book and you say it's going to be 9 issues and that's it, right, tie up as many loose ends as you can, right? Sometimes you're not always going to be able to tie up all of the loose ends, right? Some things might be left to the reader's imagination, but we want to have a nice, strong conclusion, and we want the story to have a point, right? We want to feel like we watched this for a point, and we watched or read this for a point, and there